Hi there. I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
The night I got engaged, the air was heavy with expectations. Clinking glasses, overcooked salmon fillets, the low hum of polite conversations between people who were only here because they were supposed to be. I wore white, not bridal white, just enough ivory to hint at celebration. And Matt, bless his steady hand and unwavering smile, kept checking his jacket pocket every few minutes like the ring might vanish if he didn't. My mother fluttered around the tables with a kind of nervous energy that always crept up when attention shifted away from my sister, and my father, stoic as ever, held his tumbler like a shield. Everyone knew what was coming, except for Emily, or so I let myself believe. I've always known the game my family played, the roles we were assigned long before we knew we'd audition for them. Emily was the star, the dazzling one with the soft curls, the endless boyfriends, the drama that followed her around like a designer perfume you could never quite scrub out of the air. And me, I was the good one, the one who remembered birthdays, paid rent on time, and let Emily shine, even when she tripped over my spotlight to find hers. I used to tell myself that it was maturity, that being the bigger person was noble, but standing there that evening, smiling through the ache in my jaw from holding it too long, I realized that nobility doesn't keep you warm at night. It just leaves you invisible. Matt's speech started just after dessert. He tapped a butter knife against his glass, cleared his throat, and said something about how he had never believed in the one until a woman walked into his office wearing mustard on her blazer and demanding the return of a stolen stapler. People laughed, exactly as they were supposed to. He spoke about love, quiet, steady love, the kind that doesn't scream for attention but sits with you in silence when everything else falls apart. He said I was his home. My eyes stung, and I reached for the napkin in my lap, mostly to keep from reaching for his hand in front of everyone. Then came the clink. Not from Matt's glass, but from the one in Emily's perfectly manicured hand. She stood, all theatrical pauses and widened eyes, and said, "Before we all get too drunk celebrating love, I just want to say one thing." I knew. My gut knew. My mother's eyes lit up. My father straightened his spine, and Rachel, my best friend since college, shot me a look so sharp it cut clean through the air between us. Emily placed one hand dramatically on her stomach, tilted her head in that calculated way she does when she's about to pretend something spontaneous, and said, "Guess I stole the spotlight again." A beat of silence followed, not because people were shocked, but because they were waiting to see if I'd laugh. And when Matt didn't, everyone else picked up the cue and chuckled nervously, like maybe they'd missed something. Emily added, "We weren't planning to say anything until the second trimester, but hey, what better moment than my sister's big night, right?" The room erupted. Cheers, claps, someone actually toasted with a double blessing. I looked at my mother, who was dabbing her eyes. I looked at my father, who had the audacity to raise his glass toward Emily. And then I looked at Matt, who didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't fake a damn thing. He reached for my hand under the table, squeezed it so hard it almost hurt, and whispered just one word: "Later." That night, I didn't cry. Not in the bathroom, not in the car, not in the bedroom where my makeup sat in smudged patches under my eyes like war paint. I took off my heels. I unzipped my dress. I watched Matt unbutton his shirt in silence. We were both exhausted, not from the evening, but from everything it represented. I stood in front of the mirror, trying to find the part of me that looked like a bride-to-be, and all I saw was someone who had once again been told, in front of everyone she loved, that she came second. And still, I didn't cry, because crying was for people who were shocked. I wasn't. Emily had done it before. At my college graduation, she showed up with a new boyfriend who brought a drone and spent the whole ceremony filming aerial shots of her clapping. At my book launch, she arrived 30 minutes late and managed to get seated next to a well-known editor by pretending she accidentally brought the wrong guest. Even at my grandmother's funeral, she wore white and brought gluten-free cupcakes because mourning is easier when you're nourished. Emily was Emily, a force, a black hole in a sundress, who could spin any moment into her orbit without even breaking a sweat. So I didn't cry. Instead, I opened my laptop. Matt sat beside me, shirtless, scrolling through Airbnb listings in absolute silence. And then he said it, casual, like he was asking about dinner. "What if we moved the wedding?" I turned toward him. "To when?" He looked at the calendar on his phone. "To whenever she can attend." I laughed, not because it was funny, because it was honest. And maybe for the first time in our relationship, I realized he saw it, all of it, not just Emily's stunt, but the pattern, the damage, the exhaustion I carried around like second skin. By sunrise, we had a new date, a new venue, a new list, and one very deliberate omission. When we clicked send on the new save the date, it wasn't out of spite. It was out of clarity. We didn't want a wedding overshadowed by another announcement. We wanted our moment uninterrupted, no belly, no spotlight thieves. The next morning, Emily texted, "What's this? You moved the date?" without even telling me. I didn't respond, but I watched the dots appear and disappear as she typed and deleted, and I smiled, not because I was happy, but because, for the first time in a very long time, I felt something better than happiness. I felt free. When I was younger, I believed silence was a strength, that rising above things made you better than the chaos around you, that swallowing bitterness was noble if it kept the peace, even if that peace was just an illusion carefully maintained by those who benefited most from it. But sitting at the kitchen table the morning after my engagement party, staring at my phone screen as the messages started trickling in from confused cousins, well-meaning friends, and colleagues I barely remembered inviting, I realized that silence had never protected me. It had just made me easier to ignore. The texts ranged from polite curiosity to passive-aggressive confusion, each one a little thread tugging at the edges of the decision Matt and I had made. But none of them made me question it the way Emily's did. Her message came in at exactly 8:43 a.m., just as I was pouring coffee and Matt was tossing his suit jacket into the laundry basket, with the kind of precision that said he had done it all before, cleaned up after messes that weren't his, measured patience in spoonfuls of self-control. Her text was short, almost innocent in its wording, but I knew her cadence by now. Knew the fake confusion laced with condescension, the faux hurt hiding behind emojis. She didn't send this time because she knew this wasn't a moment for winks or hearts. "What's this? You moved the date without even telling me?" No exclamation mark, no question mark. Just that cold, careful tone that left just enough space for her to claim she'd been wounded, while also reminding me she was watching. I didn't respond, not because I didn't have something to say, but because I knew anything I said would be twisted, reshaped, and replayed at the next family dinner as evidence that I was overreacting again. That I was the one making things difficult, dramatic, selfish. Instead, I forwarded the guest list changes to the new venue, confirmed the catering, and set my phone face down so her name wouldn't light up the room with more performative confusion. Matt slid me a plate of toast and said nothing, which was his way of saying everything. We had agreed the night before, no confrontation, no apologies, no explanations, just a clean cut. By noon, my mother had called twice and left a voicemail that began with a hesitant "sweetie" and ended with "call me back, okay?" in the kind of tone she usually reserved for awkward holiday scheduling or reminding me to wish my great-aunt a happy birthday. I knew what she wanted, reassurance that Emily wasn't upset, that everything was still harmonious, her favorite word to describe situations that were anything but. I didn't call her back either. I just sent a final message to our planner with the words, "We're moving forward, no changes." Rachel showed up around 2 with iced coffees and a look on her face that said she was here to talk, whether I wanted to or not. She didn't bother knocking. She never did. That was our thing, brutal honesty, no performance, no pleasantries. She handed me the drink, sat down across from me, and said, "You know you just set fire to the family group chat, right?" I shrugged, and she narrowed her eyes. Emily's been on Instagram all morning posting cryptic quotes about betrayal and how some people only celebrate others when it benefits them. It's like watching a mid-budget soap opera unfold in real time. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like days, not because it was funny, but because Rachel was right. Emily had mastered the art of vague martyrdom, of making herself look like the misunderstood victim, while quietly engineering the entire conflict behind the scenes. I knew she'd take it public. I just didn't expect it so fast. I opened Instagram and scrolled, and sure enough, there it was, a muted selfie of her holding a mug with the words, "Mama in the making," across it. Her caption reading, "Sometimes even family forgets who's always been in their corner. That's okay, we move forward." The comments were filled with predictable sympathy. "You deserve better. Stay strong. Some people are just jealous." And though none of them mentioned me by name, I felt them like darts to the chest. Not because they hurt, but because they confirmed everything I already knew. That's when Matt, silent until now, walked back into the kitchen and said, "She's trying to get ahead of the narrative." I looked at him, surprised not by the words, but by the clarity in his voice. She's always been good at rewriting history before anyone else gets a chance to tell the truth. I nodded slowly, realizing that this was no longer just about a party or a change date or even a wedding. This was about control, about a pattern, about someone who had always relied on the people around her to clean up the emotional messes she made while still demanding applause for the chaos. Rachel leaned back in her chair and said, "You've started something, and I don't think she knows how to stop it." Her voice was almost admiring, not proud exactly, but impressed, because I had done something I'd never done before. I had chosen myself. I had made a move that wasn't reactive, that wasn't defensive, that wasn't polite. I had drawn a boundary and nailed it to the wall for everyone to see. Later that evening, I opened the family group chat just to see what had unraveled in my absence. It was exactly as expected. My mom had typed a long, meandering paragraph about weddings being stressful for everyone. My dad had sent a thumbs-up emoji that felt like the digital equivalent of a shrug, and Emily had simply written, "Guess I'm not invited then." Again, no punctuation, just a statement heavy with implication. I wanted to type something. I wanted to say, "You were never not invited. You just weren't the main event," but I didn't, because that would have made it about her again. And that's what she wanted. Instead, I deleted the thread, the whole thing. I didn't want to carry their words with me into this new chapter. I didn't want them lurking in the background of my joy, like static on a radio station I never tuned into in the first place. That night, as Matt and I reviewed the updated guest confirmations and finalized the seating chart for our new downsized wedding, I felt something shift. Not in them, not in her, but in me. I was done being the accommodating one, the peacekeeper, the sister who smiled through gritted teeth, while her moments were siphoned off and served to someone else on a prettier plate. The old invitations had been printed on pearl paper, with gold trim and Emily's name scribbled on the honored guests list. The new ones, matte black, clean font, one simple phrase at the bottom. No plus ones, no distractions, just up. There's a very specific kind of silence that follows a boundary being drawn. A silence not of peace, but of reconfiguration, where every relationship around you subtly recalibrates, realigns, and quietly assesses whether the version of you they thought they knew still exists, or if you've somehow shifted into something unfamiliar, something they'll now need to handle differently and perhaps more carefully. That was the silence I found myself in during the week that followed the second round of Save the Dates, as though the ground underneath our family dynamic had shifted just enough to make everyone slightly uncomfortable, but not enough for anyone to openly admit it. The responses, or rather the conspicuous lack of them, spoke louder than any accusations could have, and that silence stretched taut like a fraying rope, just waiting for someone to tug too hard and snap it entirely. My mother finally called again on Thursday afternoon, her voice the kind of overly sweet she reserved for customer service or greeting church ladies she secretly couldn't stand. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, drawing out each syllable like she was afraid I might hang up if she spoke too quickly. And then without taking a breath, she added, I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing, and also maybe talk a little about Emily. I leaned against the kitchen counter, letting her words settle without interrupting, because I already knew what she wanted to say. She tiptoed around it for nearly 4 full minutes, commenting on the weather, the florist we used for my cousin's wedding 3 years ago, and how stressful weddings can be for everyone involved, before finally arriving at her point, which wasn't a request, but a suggestion cloaked in maternal concern. "She's just hurt, honey," she said finally, lowering her voice as if Emily might be listening through the phone. "She didn't expect you to change the date, and I think she just feels a little left out. You know how emotional pregnancy can make a person." That last line landed like a brick wrapped in cotton. I could practically hear her waiting for me to agree, to offer some contrite reassurance that I hadn't meant to upset anyone, that I'd fix it, smooth it over, bring everything back to the manufactured harmony my mother clung to like a life raft. But I said nothing. I let the silence stretch until she had no choice but to fill it. "I just think," she continued a little more hesitantly now, "that maybe it wouldn't hurt to include her in a few more things, just to make her feel involved." The laugh that escaped me wasn't even bitter. It was tired, dry, worn out from years of being expected to bend. "Involved?" I said, my voice calm but firm, each word chosen carefully like a surgeon making a precise incision. She announced a pregnancy at my engagement party and scheduled her wedding at the exact venue I had already booked, just a week before mine. And you want me to make her feel included? There was a long pause on the other end, followed by the sound of her sigh, the kind that usually preceded a guilt trip. "I'm not saying she was right," my mother offered, softening. "But I'm just asking you to consider the bigger picture. Families. We go through things, but we come back together. That's what matters." I ended the call without another word, not out of cruelty, but out of a long overdue recognition that this wasn't a conversation. It was a script, one we'd all been performing for decades, where Emily created chaos, and I was expected to provide the cleanup crew and the emotional catering. I was done being cast in that role. The next morning, I muted the family group chat, not because I couldn't handle what they were saying, but because I no longer felt any obligation to listen. Matt noticed the shift immediately. He didn't ask questions, just kissed the top of my head as he passed me in the hallway and said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. You're not folding anymore. I like this version of you." That was the thing about Matt. He saw me, not the version of me I showed to keep the family machine well-oiled, but the quiet, steady woman underneath who had learned to survive on crumbs of approval and had finally decided she wanted a seat at the table instead. But then, just when I thought things were finally beginning to settle into this new rhythm, Rachel called, her voice breathless and low, like she was calling from inside a bunker. "Okay, don't panic," she began, which of course meant I immediately did. "But I need to show you something." 30 seconds later, a screenshot landed in my inbox. It was a forwarded email chain between Emily and a popular event planner who had worked with 2 reality TV personalities and had a 6-month waiting list. The subject line read, "Urgent wedding venue conflict." My eyes scanned the thread, and there it was in black and white. Emily had reached out to this planner 3 months earlier, 3 months, inquiring about the exact venue I had chosen, asking if it could be secured for a date 1 week prior to my sister's. She had even included a note. "Would love to surprise the family with a double celebration week. She'll understand." Understand? She thought I'd understand that she had once again orchestrated a moment designed not just to overlap with mine, but to swallow it whole, to make sure that no matter what I did, I would be walking in her shadow, 2 steps behind the grand announcement she'd choreographed like a Broadway finale. My fingers clenched around the edge of the table so tightly that my knuckles turned white. "She planned it," I said aloud, more to myself than anyone else. She knew. And suddenly the entire sequence of events snapped into focus like puzzle pieces falling into place. The oversized grin at my party, the glances she exchanged with my mother, the smug tone in her voice when she rubbed her belly and said, "Guess I stole the spotlight again." It wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't emotional, and it damn sure wasn't accidental. It was a strategy, a performance. And everyone in the audience had applauded, oblivious to the fact that the star had stolen her lines from someone else's script. That night, Matt and I sat in bed, laptop open, the glow of the screen flickering across our comforter as we looked through potential changes, updated guest lists, private vows, smaller venue options, even the possibility of eloping entirely. "I'm not running," I told him quietly, more determined than I had ever felt. "I'm not moving again. She doesn't get to keep taking." He nodded, closing the lid slowly, his hand finding mine in the dark. "Then let's give them something they can't copy," he said. And that's when the idea began to take root. Not out of spite, but out of something stronger, more rooted in clarity than in anger. It wasn't about ruining her plans. It was about reclaiming mine. Because if there was one thing I'd finally learned, it was this: the only way to stop someone from rewriting your story is to write it in ink. There comes a moment in every long-standing imbalance where something imperceptible shifts, not like a dramatic collapse or an explosive argument, but more like a breath being held just a moment too long. A realization blooming quietly in the background that you're no longer willing to bend yourself into smaller shapes just to keep someone else comfortable. That moment for me arrived on a Sunday afternoon soaked in sunshine and false pleasantries, during a brunch at my parents' house that had been planned long before Emily's little bombshell, back when things still resembled civility, back when I still believed that boundaries could be enforced without consequence. Matt didn't want to go, and if I'm honest, neither did I, but there was a kind of unspoken duty that lingers in families like ours. The expectation that you show up, smile, and pretend nothing's broken, even when the cracks are starting to swallow the room whole. So we went. I wore beige, which felt like armor in its neutrality, and Matt wore his usual button-down restraint, every movement deliberate, his eyes scanning the room with that protective edge he wore so naturally, now that it barely registered as defensive. Emily, of course, was already there when we arrived, strategically positioned near the center of the table like a queen surrounded by pawns, her hands resting atop her stomach in a way that was impossible to miss and entirely performative. What struck me most wasn't her presence, or the quiet smugness she wore like perfume, but the ease with which my parents floated around her, refilling her orange juice before she even asked, adjusting the thermostat because she mentioned being chilly, asking about stroller brands and due dates as if she were the first person in human history to conceive. Not once did anyone mention the wedding, not mine, not hers. The silence around it was deafening, and in its place sat a kind of artificial cheerfulness that felt like someone playing music to drown out screaming from the other room. At one point, my mother sat down beside me, her plate barely touched, her smile brittle. "She's glowing, isn't she?" she asked, not really asking, more like inviting me to join her in the delusion that everything was fine, that we were all happy for each other, that I wasn't being slowly erased from my own narrative. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to nod or agree or soften the truth to make it easier for her to swallow. "She's always glowing," I said evenly, especially when the lights are pointed directly at her. That comment earned me a sharp look, one of those motherly warnings that said, "Don't start," even though I hadn't. I'd simply stopped pretending. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of passive-aggressive smiles and forkfuls of tension. And by the time we left, I felt like my skin had been scrubbed raw by the effort of holding it together. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Matt read quietly beside me. And when I finally spoke, my voice came out low and calm. "I need to know everything," I said. "I need to know how far she planned this." Matt didn't look up. He simply nodded and reached for his phone, scrolling until he found the screenshots Rachel had sent. The email chain with the planner, the date requests, the guest list overlaps. We went through each one like investigators at a crime scene, piecing together timelines, comparing timestamps to our own records, and by the end of it, there was no doubt left. Emily had known the venue I'd chosen. She had known the date. She had deliberately orchestrated her own wedding to fall exactly 1 week before mine, at the same location, with overlapping guests, and then announced her pregnancy in front of the very people who were meant to be celebrating my engagement, all under the pretense of family closeness and shared joy. It wasn't sabotage in the traditional sense. It was something more insidious, more manipulative, dressed up in sentimentality and sugar-coated smiles. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even feel surprised. What I felt was a kind of stillness that comes when you realize you've reached the end of a road you've been walking your whole life, and the only choices left are to turn back or carve a new path entirely. So I opened my laptop and sent an email to our new venue coordinator, confirming the final changes. Then I opened the guest list and began removing names, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. If someone couldn't respect my boundaries, they didn't deserve a seat at my table. 3 days later, on Emily's birthday, I posted a photo on Instagram. It was simple, just Matt and me standing on the courthouse steps, smiling quietly, the city skyline behind us. We hadn't eloped, not really. We still planned to have a celebration, but the legal part, that was ours, private, untouched. And beneath the photo, I wrote one sentence. No distractions, no stage, just But that wasn't what made Emily lose her mind. No, that came 5 hours later when I posted the second photo, a grainy black and white sonogram image accompanied by the caption, "Sometimes timing is everything." The internet did what it always does. Comments poured in, congratulations stacked like bricks, and speculation rippled through every thread like wildfire. Emily didn't call, she didn't text, but Rachel did. "What the hell did you just do?" she asked, half laughing, half terrified. "Are you actually?" I didn't answer, not directly, because the truth was, the sonogram wasn't mine. It belonged to Rachel. She'd been quietly pregnant for 10 weeks, hadn't told anyone except me and her husband, and when I asked if I could borrow the image for one post, just one, she hadn't even blinked before saying yes. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she understood what it meant to reclaim something, to take back the narrative, to remind the world that you are not someone's opening act. By nightfall, Emily had taken down all of her maternity content. Her stories went dark. Her profile photo changed to a flower. My mother texted me an ellipsis. My father didn't say a word. And Matt? Matt poured 2 glasses of wine, clinked his against mine, and said, "Guess you stole the spotlight back." But that wasn't the end. That was just the shift. Because while everyone else was still reeling, still gossiping, still trying to figure out what was real and what was strategic, I had already started planning the final act. Quietly, carefully, not for show, not for vengeance, just for closure. There's something curiously liberating about stepping out of a role you never auditioned for, about releasing yourself from the burden of being the understanding one, the peacemaker, the woman who endures slights with a tight-lipped smile, while everyone else reaps the comfort of your silence. And as the ripple effects of that sonogram post spread through the small social ecosystem my sister had cultivated like a hothouse orchid, carefully curated, meticulously fertilized, and ever so fragile, I found myself observing the chaos from a distance I had never dared to claim before. A distance where her tantrums didn't feel like tidal waves, but rather like the pathetic splashing of someone furious to discover they no longer held the only microphone in the room. The irony, of course, was that I hadn't lied. I hadn't claimed the pregnancy was mine. I hadn't tagged anyone, made any promises, or said anything specific at all. I'd simply offered the world a pause, a moment just ambiguous enough to make people wonder, to shift the center of gravity ever so slightly away from her and toward me, which was apparently all it took to send her spiraling. By Monday, I was getting calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly re-engaged, suddenly curious, suddenly remembering that I existed outside the shadow of my sister's perpetual spotlight. One aunt called to ask if she should reschedule her flight. as if my vague Instagram post had rewritten the family calendar entirely. Another sent flowers to my office. Just in case. It was absurd, and yet it was also, finally, equalizing. Emily didn't confront me directly. She wouldn't. That wasn't her way. Instead, she started making moves behind the scenes, contacting mutual friends to check in, dropping hints that she was worried about Jess, implying that maybe I wasn't in a good place, that maybe I had posted something impulsive out of stress or insecurity or God knows what other performance she was scripting now, that the attention had pivoted. But people didn't respond the way she expected them to. They weren't as quick to nod along, weren't as eager to echo her narrative. Some even pushed back, gently suggesting that perhaps she was reading too much into it, that maybe, for once, she wasn't the victim. The wedding she had planned, so hastily and so strategically to upstage mine, began to unravel in the most poetic fashion. It started with the florist, who dropped out due to a miscommunication about payment, then the caterer citing a scheduling conflict that suddenly couldn't be resolved. Even the venue, my original venue, called to say they were having trouble accommodating her final headcount due to space constraints, which I knew for a fact wasn't true, but I also knew the coordinator personally, and some loyalties run deeper than bookings. One by one, the pieces of her perfect day began to crumble, not because I orchestrated their collapse, but because they were built on a foundation of duplicity and assumption, on the arrogant belief that everyone would continue playing along forever. Meanwhile, Matt and I were finalizing plans for our small private celebration, something honest, intimate, and entirely ours. No performance, no pageantry, just vows whispered under string lights in a garden with no stage, and no audience except the people who had truly shown up. There was something sacred about that decision, something defiant in its simplicity, as though by choosing to shrink the spectacle, we had expanded the meaning of the moment itself. There would be no speeches hijacked by dramatic announcements, no side eyes across tables, no one waiting for a cue to start clapping louder for someone else. On the day of Emily's wedding, I didn't send a message. I didn't call, didn't post, didn't even check her social media. Instead, I walked with Matt through the neighborhood where we first met, past the coffee shop where we'd argued over whether to get a dog, past the bookstore where I had once dared him to read an entire page of Virginia Woolf without falling asleep, past the park bench where he had asked me, casually, if I believed in building something that lasted longer than the fire of first impressions. We sat on that bench for almost an hour, saying very little, the kind of silence that had nothing to do with tension and everything to do with trust. And when we finally stood, he looked at me and said, "You did it. You didn't just take your power back. You rewrote the script." But the true ending came a week later when I received an email I hadn't expected, from someone I'd nearly forgotten in the haze of recent events, Emily's fiancé, or rather her ex-fiancé, if the subject line was to be believed. "I owe you an apology, Val." It began, and the rest of the message detailed more than I needed to know. How he'd learned of her plan to overlap our wedding dates, how he hadn't been fully informed about the venue change until after the invitations were sent, how he had started to question things when she reacted so violently to my sonogram post, how he'd begun noticing the patterns, her need to win, to control, to remain the center of every narrative. He hadn't left her because of me. He made that clear. He'd left her because the version of her she presented to the world didn't hold up when the lights dimmed and the performance ended. I didn't reply. I didn't forward it to anyone. I just sat there, letting the words sink in, not as validation but as closure, because in the end, I hadn't needed to expose her or confront her or even outshine her. I'd simply stopped allowing myself to be edited out of my own story. There's a photo on my nightstand now, one from the night Matt and I said our private vows. It's not professional, it's slightly blurry. My hair is windblown, and his tie is crooked, and we're laughing so hard that neither of us is looking at the camera. It is, by far, my favorite picture we've ever taken, because for once, there was no audience, no stage, no spotlight. And yet somehow it was the brightest I'd ever felt.